I'm Jim Davis, editor and co founder of Edge Industry Review. Today, we're going to talk about cybersecurity, more specifically, cybersecurity in the context of manufacturing operations, IT, OT security. Cybersecurity risks, things such as ransomware and phishing attacks, have been in the news a lot. They're ranked as the sixth biggest and threatening external risk to business success these days, behind inflation and supply chain relationships. So, manufacturers realize that they need to digitize operations. They want real time insight into what's going on in their business. But doing that presents some challenges. So, today we're going to talk with Ahmik Hindman, Senior Network and Security Solution Consultant at Rockwell, to discuss why IT and security teams in manufacturing businesses are overlooking these risks associated with IT and OT convergence. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, tell us a little bit about what you do at Rockwell, and then tell us what is meant by IT OT convergence. And isn't there some sort of convergence necessary because we want to connect the OT part of the business in real time with the IT part to understand operations and inventory?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I work with our customers to help secure their industrial control systems and also utilize that data in making business decisions. So there's a balance there between, the security aspect and also utilization of that information because the control systems are really data rich, right? There's lots of data that we can harvest and make good business decisions, but we have to do that securely. So that's the challenge is that balance between that security and also, utilizing that information, whether it be on-prem or now we're seeing more trends to go leverage cloud-based services for that.
I'm curious, in terms of what you have been seeing, is there one part of the business that's more or less secure than the other? The direction of attacks, are attacks being aimed more at central IT and radiating out towards the OT part of systems, or is it the reverse?
Yeah, I think if you look at traditional manufacturing businesses out there, IT typically does a good job of managing their assets. They've got a perimeter, which is called the IDM, it's called the DMZ, demilitarized zone, some type of firewall. They're doing web applications inspection. They might be doing some deep packet inspection, but oftentimes that stops at the business level systems. And in today, depending on the maturity of the organization, we've seen a lot of customers that don't have segmentation between their business systems and their OT or manufacturing systems. And that can be problematic. When someone clicks on that email and now you get a ransomware worm propagating, it's very easy to have those OT systems infected, especially since many of those systems aren't patched regularly. So if we look at manufacturing as the number one target for ransomware because of that fact. It's simply a crime of opportunity. People are realizing, these systems are unpatched. They haven't been touched. There's no monitoring in that space. And their customers are starting to connect those together.
So then, what are some of the strategies for mitigation? Is it patching, at least in terms of traditional IT, is actually an often overlooked aspect of security that even advanced teams can buff once in a while. Maybe what are you suggesting to your customers in terms of mitigation strategies?
Yeah. So you had mentioned that good patching is a key aspect. When we look at mitigation strategies, we're looking at a defense in depth architecture. It starts with policy, looking at this kind of onion shaped policies and procedures. You look at network, you get down to compute services, you look at endpoint detection, and all of that kind of plays into an overall strategy to protect those systems. Specifically with ransomware, one of the key areas we talk about is that putting a demilitarized zone or IDMZ. We talked about the segmentation between the enterprise level between the internet and that's the DMZ. You take that a step lower between the business level systems and the OT systems, and that's called the IDMZ. And the whole concept there is that I'm inspecting that traffic. I don't have direct traffic flow. I'm going through some type of proxied service and then being able to obfuscate that IP address scheme, those systems down below. And I'm trying to minimize the amount of direct traffic going through those systems. And so if you have that in place in combination with an effective patch management strategy, and we're starting to monitor that systems in the OT space with a intrusion detection solution, that's a very good way to start to protect from ransomware. And so that's one of the things which we talk to customers about is as deploying that holistic kind of defense in depth strategy.
I'm also curious about when you're going into these environments, even within a single company and the different plant sites, for instance, there might be a slightly different version of equipment, or there might be multiple manufacturers. What does patch management look like in that sort of a heterogeneous environment?
Yeah, that's a good question because it really depends on the manufacturer and the equipment they get. Sometimes you get suppliers that have a comprehensive management of that equipment, and they are actually monitoring and take care of those systems. And if the end customer touches that and makes a modification, well, nulls it voids the warranty on that system. So oftentimes you have kind of dedicated systems that in some cases can't be patched because they've got a proprietary card that is reliant on that legacy operating system and older controllers that don't work with the software. It's a kind of a snowball effect that in some cases requires a zone-based firewall and additional controls on top of that to protect those systems that can't be patched. Now, there's a whole slew of other cases where those compute surfaces do have the ability to be patched. There's just not an effective strategy. There's not a place and process in place to do that. We've seen in some cases where IT has taken that ownership. There are some challenges with that too, though. If you look at the differences between traditional IT and OT, the the policies that talk about the traditional, sure you've heard the CIA versus IAC, the confidentiality, integrity, availability versus the inverse on the OT side. It's availability is key, then followed
Mm.
by integrity, then followed by confidentiality. So, in the OT space, we're not really too concerned about encrypting data from the HMI to the controller or from the controller to to the IO module, the drive or whatever. Now, that can be done. And in some cases, if we're talking about a secret recipe that we don't want to have sent from the HMI down to the controller, well, we have mechanisms to encrypt that. But majority cases, that is not required. And so those different priorities play into that overall patch management strategy. So if we look at what IT does and says, hey, we got a patch, there's a vulnerability that Microsoft talks about it and it's being addressed in the latest firmware. They might have a patch rollout processing where they do that once a month or twice a month. That is not going to work for the OT in most cases because there's so many other dependencies that has to be looked at, from the software that's running on that to the control systems and oftentimes there's that one-to-one relationship between the firmware running the controller and the software that's installed on that engineer workstation.
Certainly a lot of, as you say, interrelationships and complexities there.
Right.
So maybe that leads a little bit into another question then. What role should government agencies play in mandating security and reporting efforts? I mean, obviously, it's pretty difficult in and of itself. And some of these companies that are making equipment aren't necessarily going to be that cooperative with each other. What kind of a role will, say, in the US, the CISA play?
Yeah, I think for right now, it's tied to the critical infrastructure where, look at EPA for water and wastewater or TSA for gas transmission. Those are agencies that have to enforce what, like presidential mandates that have come out on industrial cybersecurity. I think it's a good idea and a good strategy because to we have to get private industry to start to adopt some of this stuff. And, you know, we've got I've got another gentleman that just focuses on one of my colleagues that's all he does is cyber legal and spends a lot of time focusing, helping our customers understand, you know, how do we interpret this regulation that's coming out? How is it applicable to me? But we're starting to see where that is, especially on the financial impact and reporting of ransomware, where that's starting to go from the government agencies to to private or public companies that might not be necessarily classified in that critical infrastructure. But overall, I think it's great because we need the secure systems. There are a lot of industrial control systems out there that are wide open, that are running on a flat network, meaning that there's no segmentation between different systems. So if once something gets infected, it's just wildfire, right? Ransomware just easily spreads. So overall, I think it's a great strategy and something that we should be adopting, not only within our critical infrastructure, but like I said, in other industries as well.
Yeah, and you referenced this a little bit. I don't know what the status is at the moment, but the SEC has also proposed reporting regulations and tying some financial penalties,
Right.
apart from whatever bad publicity effects there might be, especially for public companies to have to report that, again, should spur some activity. Maybe there are some other trends that are influencing what companies are doing. I think you mentioned cyber insurance. Maybe you can tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about what's going on in that part of the financial world.
Yeah, and especially in the manufacturing space where right now manufacturing is the number one target. And I've seen different figures from, Dragos was talking about it like in the 70% range. I saw another one where it's 30%. Nevertheless, it's falling somewhere in between there that manufacturing is a target because of those unpatched systems and the because of the lack of segmentation between that IT and enterprise zone and no monitoring. So right now, whether it's a cybersecurity insurance rider or a general insurance policy, those companies are having to pay or pay for. The insurance companies are realizing, hey, we need to protect ourselves. They're paying out more, and so they're coming out with very detailed responses for our customers to say, what are you doing in that OT space? Do you have a disaster recovery plan for manufacturing? We'll have one for IT, but oftentimes you don't see that in the OT space. What are you doing for change management? Do you have a backup of all your programs? What are you doing for patch management? These are items that are being called out in the questionnaires. And if they don't have a policy in place, they're paying higher insurance premiums. And so that's another big driver. So you have the regulatory side, and then you also have it coming from the insurance side. So which I think, again, both of those are great ideas because we have to do a better job of securing our control systems out there.
So are the insurance companies doing any auditing of their own yet? I've heard about that in some instances and in some industries. I don't know if that's in the case for manufacturing as well.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any empirical evidence on that other than the fact that they have the questionnaires. So I'm assuming they're following up on those questionnaires and actually saying, "Hey, okay, you say you do this, show me. What are you doing?" Provide that proof. Whether they're following that up with in-person visits. We know that some of those insurance companies also require pen testing. And so validating that your controls are functioning properly. So that's another service that Rockwell has started to do for our customers because it's being called out. And typically, I've seen a majority of organizations have it at least once a year. Some have it twice a year where they have to prove, and provide some third party to be able to try to infiltrate their systems and then test essentially their security controls.
Okay,
So
that's interesting.
that
Yeah, I didn't
yeah.
know Rockwell was doing that. Are you doing the auditing, serving as an auditor as well, or just doing the pen testing? Maybe you can describe a little bit about how you fit into this new picture.
Yeah, so there's certainly from the control standpoint, we do it we have a risk assessment we'll do. And some are there's a high level that we can perform or very detailed. So an example is one that I was working with is about a 16-week process where we'll come on site, evaluate all the systems, define the crown jewels, the critical pieces of the manufacturing or process control facility, talk to their management teams, talk to operations, talk to engineering to understand what policies and procedures are in place. Are people following them? Do they have controls that enforce the policies and procedures? And then providing them a very detailed report saying, here's how you rate, and here's some of the controls, and even correlating that to some industrial cybersecurity standards like IEC 62443, which you're going to, we'll hear more about that. And there's different security levels that correspond with that. So that's developing the risk and saying, here's your controls that you have in place, and here's where you're vulnerable. And then we can help them secure those systems. So that's one aspect more on the risk side. And then of course, we'll also do the penetration testing you know, from with authorization and guardrails to say, okay,
Yeah.
here's the systems you can't go after, but just to prove out some of the controls there that they have in place.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that with us
Yeah.
today. I appreciate you coming on and talking about security. It's definitely a ongoing issue. And yeah, again, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure.